All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening, or whenever you're getting this video. Hey, maybe it's the middle of the night. Hey, Mike here with you for a few minutes. I'm just talking about a few concepts, a few tips to help you stack the deck in your favor as far as, selling stuff on eBay. Right now, I'm not claiming to be the master at eBay. There's plenty of other gurus on eBay that certainly have plenty of great advice, right? And I encourage, doing a wide variety of research to some extent. At the same time, maybe dive right into it to some extent. That's part of what I would even be talking about here. And I'll get to a few points, just covering a few main key points, like I said, to help you stack the deck in your favor. So I encourage listening to them all, but like I said, gathering other perspectives. At the same time, kind of keep it simple. I mean, it's like we're talking about eBay. Other platforms, yes, I get it, and I don't claim to have experience with most of those platforms. Mainly eBay, right? Because I find that generally speaking, you could sell almost anything on eBay, right? Basically, virtually anything. Then on there's legal elements to consider. Certain items they might not allow because of recalls or some copyright or vero warnings and whatnot. And like you said, if like, I don't claim to know every element of that and what you should do in every single situation, but generally what I do is if, they tell me not to sell an item, I'm just going to not sell that item on eBay. I'm not going to attempt to try to sell it, circumvent the rules in some way, if that makes sense. Just because, your eBay account can be valuable, right? And what I recommend doing, is a few key things, right? What I'm talking about, being able to sell virtually anything on eBay, and there's a few elements that go into that. 'Cause I think a lot of people think, when they're starting to sell on eBay, well, what do I have to sell? They might even have a hard time thinking of something to sell at the beginning in some cases. Maybe other times, some of you might be thinking, I could have plenty of stuff I could sell, but you're still unsure about some elements like, shipping or whatever. You might be overthinking it a bit, right? Like I said, make a listing, right? Don't be afraid to maybe make a mistake the first time or two. Use something simple. Find either some old shoes or some old tools or some old clothing item. Certain items are going to be easier to list than others. Maybe you're beginning and starting out. If you're already experienced, you already know this. But if you're already experienced, I'm sure you'd agree that it took you a learning curve, probably taking, doing a good amount of listings. Now, if you're doing just individual items, it's probably kind of the most, how'd you say, grassroots way to do eBay, if you will. You're reselling items, right? That you either maybe you purchased and have for a long time that you don't want anymore. Old items, maybe they belong to somebody that passed them on to you, or maybe you were given some items, or like I said, you found or obtained items, like you found, somebody gave you some tools, and maybe you don't really use some of them or all of them, right? So there's a few reasons why you might want to get rid of items. Maybe, like I said, besides from just making profit. Same time, yeah, you're looking to maybe make some money back on these items. It's like maybe you could donate some stuff, sure, but same time you could use this inventory to get it to people who are, like I said, if you donate it, a lot of times you might be taking it to a Goodwill or something like that. They're just going to resell it. A lot of times they'll be selling it for top dollar in many cases. So, if you don't have much time to resell, you have a great job and a great career, this maybe not something you're wanting to do. But if you do have extra time, you maybe make a limited amount of money at your job, you want to have some extra stream of income, right? Not necessarily going to make a fortune unless, you're kind of digging for inventory more. Me personally, I kind of do this like a part-time kind of casual thing to just, downsize stuff that, gradually I don't want to replace, or whatever, something I'm not using anymore, or I got a better version, or I got, a few other items of clothing and now I don't wear these few items anymore, some jeans, whatever it might be, right? So each item being individual, obviously it takes, a little bit of research for each item to some extent, right? There's factors that go into that. There's factors that go into listing efficiently and quickly. Now, I'm not claiming to be the best at it, certainly no, but I would say, your idea is to be able to list a good value worth of stuff in a reasonably short amount of time. And it doesn't mean that necessarily you're just being so picky about, listing the most expensive stuff. You might be thinking, hey, well, let me list the most valuable items I have first. But at the same time, you might list, you only have like a few items or something like that. You think, these are higher value items that are worth like, $50 or more. Maybe even have items that are more like you're selling a guitar or something like that. You want to do, I recommend kind of getting to know eBay. If you're kind of getting to know eBay, if you're just starting an account, you're thinking about starting an account, or you're thinking about how do I start to sell on eBay, test a few more medium, smaller household type of items, get some views, like I said, there's different factors to listing, right? There's how you list your item. Are you listing it as a buy it now type of it? A lot of people think auctions, probably maybe when they're first getting on eBay. I recommend kind of steering clear of auctions until you understand why and when you might want to do auctions, right? Auctions are probably, for many cases, maybe an ambiguously valued item, most of the time because you want to get rid of the item quickly, right? And maybe get a reasonable amount of money for it if it's of value to where someone might, pay you some money. But like I said, you want to get rid of the item within 7 to 14 days or whatever the auction times might be, right? So the limits, I should say, the time limits. Like the auction times can be whenever you want. You can list the item in an auction and whatever you want. People are going to see it, but, are they going to bid on it? What kind of item were you talking about? Is it a cell phone that you had a couple years ago that still works well, that, maybe you paid a couple $100 or more on it, $500 phone, it's a decent mid-range or something like that, and you're trying to resell it now. And at the same time, with the phone, do you really need to sell that phone quickly? Maybe you need money now for some reason, and that's why you're auctioning stuff. But maybe the other reasons is oftentimes it's like you have some stuff that's taking up space, right? Or you're moving or something like that, right? That might be a reason why you want to auction some stuff off quickly, right? Maybe you're just going to get whatever you can for a bunch of clutter you've had in your garage, and you're making room for something else quickly that's going to be coming, or somebody else is going to be moving into that room, and you want to try to sell some of that stuff, whatever it was. Depending, like I said, larger items that are low value, yeah, you're probably not necessarily going to spend time trying to sell them. They're going to cost a lot in shipping, stuff like that. And you're trying to sell stuff on eBay, right? Like I personally do a 30-day return on all items, right? So I'm not thinking, that with an auction, they could probably still do that kind of thing too, like especially if it's not as described. So I don't know all about that, right? But as far as auctions, those are some of the reasons why you might do an auction, right? Maybe you have some artwork you want to auction off on eBay. But it's like I said, it's a time limit type of thing. The idea is to get some people bidding on it and competing on it. But if you don't have a lot of views, that might be a factor. It's not a highly searched item, or it shows up in an auction under like something that just doesn't really get very many views or searches, right? A low value item, then yeah, you're probably not going to want to auction it. You want the right person to find that item at a decent price when they're searching for it, right? They're searching for that item. Auction is more like something that shows up as soon as somebody looks up cell phones and they look up under auctions. It shows a few different options that might be up for auction right then, and people are going to think making a bid, waiting a few days to actually do the transaction if they win the auction, etc. A lot of people just want to buy the item and receive the item within like a promised amount of time, right? So there's another thing too, like you said, the shipping, you want it to be kind of reasonably quick. I say 2-day handling, maybe 3 days if you have some item you feel like might take you a little bit of time to package or something like that, maybe. But for the most part, like 2 days handling, or even 1 day. But I recommend giving yourself a little leeway. I don't know if it's going to make a huge difference in most of your orders. I think most people that order on eBay understand at least 2 to 5 days. Maybe some cases even a little longer for shipping to arrive, especially if it's like a long ways, doing ground delivery. But there's other options for shipping, and this might take you a little time to learn. But I recommend it in the beginning for a newbie, if you will. A newbie might start out with like just mostly ground delivery, USPS, right? USPS, United States Postal Service, probably the lowest cost, most efficient pricing and delivery wise for your shipping, right? So, but then you might understand why later on, hey, you might want to use UPS for some certain item, like you're selling a chair or something like that, or a fan, and it's a larger item, or just some every now and then that can happen. But for me personally, I never actually shipped anything with UPS, maybe one time actually, I think. And I found that USPS, they can do free pickup if you need it, right? In most places. I don't know about all places, but at least probably most places, they do free pickup. So if you can't get to the post office so easily, or for whatever reasons, you can have them pick up the packages that you're shipping out, right? Like I said, the shipping is a factor. So you also want to estimate about the item's size and weight, right? That means having some kind of one or even two types of scales, a smaller scale that might measure. It depends on what kind of items you're mostly selling. Like if you have a bunch of appliances or something, that might, you might require, they might like 10 to 20 pounds each or more. Then that's one thing, right? If you have some other smaller types of items, just like hand tools or something that weigh in a few ounces to a pound, or whatever it is, or shirts, clothes, they weigh like half a pound to a pound, right? Typically. So those items, it's like not going to cost a lot to ship. One thing is nice because, bigger items that are low value, you think about it, the shipping might be a bit. And if you're offering returns, and maybe you're asking the buyer to pay for the return shipping if they don't like the item. But, at the same time, you don't really want to encourage people to put item not as described, which they might do if the shipping's a lot. They might think, oh, well, I could just put item not as described, or say it was defective, or do something nefarious that's not so truthful. You want to encourage people to have good reason to send the item back because there was an honest discrepancy in the listing, like it's just not well described in some way. I mean, go ahead and refund the shipping too, unless if the shipping's real expensive, you'll be aware of that. Right, somebody returns an item that had like $30 in shipping, something more expensive, not really expensive, but like you said, it's a weightier, heavier item, or bigger item, and the shipping was a bit. Maybe you sold a quilt blanket and it took a big box to put it in or something, and even though it was kind of only a $20 blanket, but the shipping was like $30 or something. And for some reason they say return it, there's a stain that they didn't show in the listing, or there's a tear that wasn't said, it's not as described. The description essentially wasn't accurate, right? Then, more likely they could try to return it because of that. Or if it's defective, it's not working, an electronic item, it's like, you said it was a good, the item was working as far as you could tell, but it's not doing some function or something like that, it's just not working. So then they return it, and essentially you're, even if you promise them to not, even if you say for the buyer to pay return shipping, in those cases, item not described, it's going to be more, you're going to be compelled and maybe even obligated by eBay to pay for the return shipping as well, right? Because they didn't get the product that they were expecting, right? That was in the listing. It wasn't accurately described. Now, obviously, they didn't like the item when they got it, or maybe it didn't fit. That could be a discrepancy if it's something that didn't fit because, your size was listed wrong, or it didn't have enough elements to it. But at the same time, you should be honest with the listing. Say, hey, look, this is a 32 by 30 pants, and this is the, just give, maybe do the inseam, or what, give measurements of as much as you can, and do good pictures, so you don't get hardly any returns, right? To be honest, I really don't get hardly any return on clothing items because they take pretty good, clear pictures. At least, more like, 7 to 15 pictures or something like that. Maybe even up to 20 or 25 in some rare cases. If it's an item really needs to have pictures all over, just kind of quickly, maybe hang it up too, lay it down on a whiteboard or something, but also hang it up kind of quickly, just doing a good amount of pictures and a good few options, and even maybe going excessive so that when you make your listing, you have the best ones to choose from to put in that listing. Maybe you'll use all 25, maybe you only use 5 or 10. But at the same time, I recommend, for the most part, always taking a good few extra pictures, especially a few extra main pictures of your item, because you might want to change that listing later. And this is a big deal, in my opinion. You have listings that you make on eBay. Some of them will stick around for a long time because they're just not selling, or selling as quickly, right? At the same time, you can't predict what's going to sell at any time. You'll sell a couple few items, you think, wow, this item, I thought this item was never going to sell. That's the idea behind listing everything kind of briskly. That, you're building up stuff in a pile that you're listing, stuff that you don't want anymore, you find, whatever it is, the idea is you're going to leave that, in your inventory and not mess with it until it's sold. You might buy something else ahead of time. You're kind of doubling up on maybe some stuff you own, but eventually you start making profit off it. Overall, you're getting ahead, right? You're selling more stuff on eBay. eBay is sending you more referrals, more traffic, right? Because they're seeing that you regularly sell. They make money on your account. You're doing some maybe promoted listings to maybe 3 to even as high as like maybe up to 10%. But I would say, I know that it looks like, eBay's making a bunch of money off of they're making money off of your account. At the same time, where else are you going to sell that many of those used items for the prices that you could sell them for on eBay? Honestly, like an item, this was just a denim jacket that was used, but no, actually pretty good condition. And they even wrote a comment and said, "Hey, like new condition," because it was in pretty good condition. I sold it for $25. The shipping was $18.40, right? So overall, they paid $45 for this used Levi jacket. And it's a decent looking jacket. They're happy with it, more than happy with it apparently. But I'm just saying, where else are you gonna sell? That's just one example. There's just a Levi jacket, which is actually maybe even not necessarily one of my higher items. Like I sold a book also, a Norton Shakespeare book, right? It's Shakespeare. It's a pretty thick book, and I sold another one of the same book not long ago for about $35 or $40. This time I sold it for $27 plus $8 and some change shipping. So, the shipping and the fact, they're paying for shipping, right? That's what people are going to do on eBay, honestly. Like, you're doing this method, this approach. And the idea, like you said, is to listing everything decently. And that's going to take you time because, if you're doing this part-time like I do, especially, you might, do an hour or two a night here and there, or maybe not even every night or every day or whatever it is because, you're part-time just doing it to get rid of some old stuff. You're not necessarily thinking massive profit, like doing eBay as your main business, not necessarily quitting your job over it or whatever. Now, maybe if you want to do that, then yeah, like that's, you have to be motivated. You have to get into it and really be like, hey, I'm going to focus on this all day. And, maybe I don't know about quitting your other jobs, but, essentially giving it most of any free time you have to basically, source and list a bunch of stuff. Right, source and list a bunch of inventory, and however you do it, you access inventory in different ways. You maybe go out and like a lot of people go out and obtain items in Goodwill and maybe like thrift stores and stuff like that. That's gonna take you time and shopping around and everything a bit. You can also maybe access some stuff online. You can get bargains on. One big thing is maybe a wholesale, right? Maybe you can get a good quantity of something or be a distributor for something that you can legally resell on eBay, right? So that's a possibility. But I think that for a lot of us, it's about just essentially obtaining goods in any reasonable way you can with efficiency, right? Without going too far out of your way. Like you say, if you're doing this full time, I would imagine you could do a good number of listings a day. If I did 10 listings, that might take me a couple hours or less, right? Not that long, maybe an hour I could do actually up to 10 listings. It depends on what I'm listing, right? What are you listing? Are you listing something that you have to prepare it and get it in a certain scenario to take pictures of it well? Or, are you cleaning up your items before you list most of any items that you're listing, which is what I like to do. I kind of get it ready. I get all the components of the item ready, right? That might be going along with the item. Maybe you're selling a toaster oven and it has a few different extra, a few racks, some attachment, whatever it is, that might be going with an item. Try to, make sure you get all the components in their photos, right? And of course in your description, but, mainly your photos, right? So they can even see that, hey, yeah, that item is includes this and that, and includes everything that I'm looking for or whatever. It's part of your description. The main part of your description really is a lot of times for most items your photos, right? Well, sometimes the item might be sold by a lot, like by the description, but for the most part, 95% of items. I mean, I'm not saying that's an exact number, but like I said, listing a good amount of items briskly, so that over time you build up a good, maybe even a few hundred or even up to 1,000. I don't, I've never had 1,000, but I find that for me with everyday household goods, shoes, clothing items, old kitchenware, some tools, just everyday items, books, whatever. I can sell them at about up to a 45% plus sell-through rate in my store, which isn't like a strict number, but you get an idea about the total number of things that I've listed and the total number of things that I've sold. About a 45% sell-through rate on basic items and selling them at pretty reasonably, I would say high prices, but because I would say I'm pretty reasonable at most prices, but they're paying for shipping as well. So, kind of be flexible a little bit on some items. I'm taking offers. Most of that's what I've been doing lately, right? For a long time, I did it without taking offers. I would sell items regularly, but then I feel like, yeah, some items it's kind of hard for me to tell how much it's worth, and sometimes I might feel like, oh, I want to get more. Maybe they have a bit of inventory building up, and I want to kind of clear some of it out a little bit brisklier. I'm gonna brisker, if there's a word, but you get the idea is to, maybe move your inventory a little quicker. Like you said, you might do some promoted listings. That's on eBay, paying a percentage for each sale. In that case, I sell some items like that. I also sell plenty of items through natural listings as well that I don't get charged for a fee. So they still have those listings. If you list a bunch of items, it's not like they're going to cut you out of organic listings and make them all promoted. But at the same time, you'll see, oh yeah, the fact is I probably wouldn't have sold these extra 5 or 10 items if it wasn't for the promoted listings. They sold some promoted listings, and I can look back at a few items I have in my deal, and actually noticing here it's not necessarily telling me right on their main page of sold listings right now. But the idea is that it's but it will, if you look in the order, it'll tell you here whether you're getting an ad fee for it. You might look at that ad fee and think, oh, maybe depending on the price of the item, the ad fee might be like, a couple bucks, might be up to, 5 or 10 or 50. But, if you're selling a more expensive item for a few $100s, it might be like $50 or something like that, 10% of the price or something. So you want to be aware, maybe some more expensive item you're selling, you might want to think either you're pricing it pretty high and, so you're making up for that. But also at the same time, you might just not put it on promoted listing. Maybe those more expensive items you might leave them off promoted. You're not necessarily expecting to sell them real fast. Like you said, you're selling a guitar for $500 to $1,000 or something or more. Then you might be thinking, no, I'm going to give that some time to maybe sell at that price. Same time, if you're trying to sell it quickly, yeah, you probably expect, in this case, if you're promoting your listing to try to sell it quickly, which is, no wrong, you can drop the price too. That might not necessarily give it the more visibility that maybe promoting it you can, right? So it's kind of a balance, and you have to practice yourself to learn that. But I'm just saying, whatever you're selling, be aware of that. There's a few items that you might decide to take off promoted listings. Maybe for whatever reasons. Maybe you feel like, oh, it's going to involve a little more work shipping this item. I don't want to lose any extra money on it for no reason. I'm going to leave it off promoted listings, or this is a bigger item or a more expensive item, and I don't want to have to spend $100 just to sell it. But remember, you're very likely going to be sitting on that item for longer. Bottom line, if you want to sell the items more briskly and even have a chance of selling the more expensive items more quickly, you might go ahead and do the promoted listings. Understand, hey, you're going to spend a little money. Like I said, you might price it a little bit higher to kind of make up for some of that, right? Maybe not totally. Maybe you want to go excessive high, and maybe you're going to see if you can sell it at a real high price. But I think you're going to want to be within the realm of reason still, even with the promoted listings, if that makes sense. So those are a few things. But like I said, listing a lot of things is going to give you more visibility on your store. Right? Even if it's a small item, you're thinking, why would I bother selling this item, or this item's defective or broken, or it's not working anymore. List it honestly. Say, hey, this listing's, doesn't seem to function anymore. It might need repair, or it doesn't seem to work, or, but say as is, or what you see is what you get. Make it clear that, the item maybe doesn't function, or what's exactly is wrong with it, and then maybe they know how to repair it. Maybe they're just looking for the other functions on it that do work, and whatever reason they're willing to buy it. Maybe not necessarily going to expect to sell it for like a high price, but you sell it for a third or a half of the price of what it might normally sell for because it's broken or it needs repair. It's only partially working. That's something to consider, but don't discount it. Like it's trying to think of something that they sold at least a couple things that weren't fully functional, and people still buy them. But like I said, I sold some old paints for modeling, for models, like testers paint, right? So it's like enamel paint, and people use it for those tiny model paints. And it's like I had just a few. I'm not sure how I obtained them a long time ago. Found them or something, I think, actually. And they didn't really, like, no big deal. Like, unless somebody really knows what they're for, they're probably not going to care about it. Nobody's going to walk by them, especially in my area. And nobody's looking to get some extra junk that, not necessarily junk, but just stuff that they don't need. And so at the same time, I picked them up and I can see that they're generally still good. They're not necessarily packaged great or nothing or anything that's kind of out of their packages or whatever, but you can see that overall they actually sell for $20 for like 5 bottles of it. I can sell it for $20 and, list them just on eBay real quick. No big deal. Since I can even use the UPC barcode to identify the product when I'm doing the listing on the eBay app, right? So you're doing the listing on your eBay mobile app, use the little, it'll say, well, what are you trying to sell? And then it'll have at the top, it'll have the option, there's a little icon in the search bar that will allow you to scan a UPC code or barcode on an item, right? So if the item is like a book, oftentimes it'll have a barcode, an ISBN number in the back. And you can take that little button on the top of the eBay app when you're making a listing, say, what are you trying to sell? And you hit that little button and you can just scan the UPC code and it'll make the list, like the book especially, all the books look the same many times, or it's going to identify that, it's going to bring up that exact book typically like 99% of the time. And you just make the listing off that, maybe add your own pictures of the book, which I recommend doing, like unless it's in perfect condition, maybe then whatever. But I think you're not going to necessarily, like, I don't use any other photos. I recommend just not using, always have your own photos of your item, right? If that makes sense, right? Unless and it's okay to use a stock photo for an item for some reason, don't do it, right? If that makes sense. But those are just a few tips, right? Like I said, listing a lot of these items briskly, because at first you're thinking, maybe you sell an item here and there. You have 50 items, depending on what you're selling. If you're selling some cell phones in the mix, probably a few of them will sell pretty quick, depending on what you're asking for the price. But I'm just saying, you'll probably get some action on them pretty quick because it's an electronic type of item. It's in categories a lot of people get into, right? Electronics. They want to buy, older, retro electronics, or they want to repair electronics, or whatever reasons. It's high demand, right? So electronic like phones might sell quickly, but at the same time, if you're listing everyday household items, you have some old clothes, maybe you have some broken phone that still turns on, but it's a broken screen or something, or maybe it just totally doesn't work, but maybe somebody will pay $15 for it still, whatever. It's not like much money. I'm not saying that's necessarily worth your time. If you have a decent job, you might be a little bit, picky about this if you're thinking, oh, well, but at the same time, if you have that extra, maybe just leave that stuff towards the end. Maybe one night you say, oh, let me list these 10 items that I thought were kind of piddly, but are still, worth maybe 10 or $20, whatever it is, right? Like I said, and even just some old charging cable or some cord that goes to some item you don't even have anymore, but you still have the cord, and it's a unique cord. Someone might be looking for that cord and they're willing to pay $15 or $25 or whatever for it. Not necessarily like a super high price, but maybe it's hard for them to get just that cord by itself, right? And they're looking for that. You might find somebody that needs that item. So, like I said, anything that you think, an old, belt, whatever, you might think, oh, it's not worth it. List it for 15 or $20, right? Plus shipping, and accept offers, right? So every now and then someone sends you an offer, $8 and whatever. Okay, well, you want to sell it. Maybe you feel like you can hold out on it longer, but at the same time, to some degree, you might take most offers. $8 plus shipping for an old belt that you didn't want anymore. Maybe that wasn't really the best deal or best example. Maybe you're listing it for $15 and they offer you $10 or $9 for it, and you're willing to accept that, right? And because you want to move some inventory, you want to trigger with eBay that you're making sales, that they're making some money off of. They maybe get you more traffic for your other items, right? So it's a culminating snowball effect with this method, right? So like I said, you get a bunch of items listed over time, a month or two or three, or however many you're doing a day. Maybe you can list a bunch, and some days you list a lot, and other days you're kind of you're listing 2 or 3 or 5 items or something like that, or maybe up to 10 items. Maybe you're doing it full time and you're thinking like every day you're going to list at least 15 to 30 items or more, or maybe you have high value items that you only need to list 5 a day, and that's going to get you into money because you're making $200 on every one of these items, however you're obtaining your items, whatever it is. And there's all kinds of different ways you could be obtaining all kinds of different inventory. I'm not saying to steal it, obviously. I'm just saying there's all kinds of ways that you could be obtaining inventory in general that you might have that I might not know about. You have, maybe you work in construction and you have a lot of job sites end up with extra inventory that they normally throw away, and it seems like it's kind of trash. Same time you're saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this extra roll of insulation or whatever it is actually is worth a few bucks. And they were just throwing it in the stream. Maybe you know how you just through your job you have access to certain types of inventory. Might be normally seen as throwaway inventory that might actually have some value. So don't discount anything, right? You're starting out with small stuff, but you got to get better and better at listing in general over time, right? If you're doing a bit of listings, kind of quickly, just get right into it. I'm going to take these pictures, I'm going to take these measurements and have a scale or two, maybe like a smaller scale, maybe a bigger regular weight scale. Real honestly, that's all I do is I'll weigh something. If something weighs a few pounds, I'll weigh it on a regular standing scale. I'll just stand on it, say I weigh whatever my weight is, and then I'll hold the item and I'll just take that difference, right? So nothing wrong if you find there's some inaccuracies with your weighing method. That's something to take into account. But generally speaking, assuming your scales work well, then maybe I'll take a small table scale as well, which I use most of the time, especially smaller and medium items, which is what I mostly do. I'm just saying you can also use a regular scale as well. So it's not like you necessarily have the fancy weighing equipment, fancy scale with all this electronic readout. I'm wrong, you maybe have electronic readout, but just a basic scale that costs 10 or 20 bucks or something like that will do the trick, for weighing most items. Well, like I said, you want to have a scale that does weigh on a micro level, down to the ounce at least, right? So those are like medium items and smaller items, if that makes sense. And bigger items, yeah, as long as I measure to the pound, you'll probably be fine. But you do want to compensate a little bit for that shipping on many items, especially bigger items where might take more shipping. Might need more size than you expect. It might take a little bit more weight for padding and other packing material than you expect. Might take an extra pound. Maybe you're selling like an air fryer or something. You just said going to put a bit of padding around it for whatever reasons. It may have a glass area and just stuff like that might require an extra pound or three of packing material. Depending on what kind of packing material you're using. Are you using paper? Or are you using like bubble wrap? Bubble wrap is probably lighter, I think, than like a thick brown paper that might be used, but it kind of depends on what situation calls for, right? You have to take that into account. If you're going to list something, do I have a way to ship it? Do I have the right box or access to the box? And you might think, oh, I'll get the box, but in many cases you might say, oh, wait a minute, it's actually harder to find or get this box than I thought, if you're thinking about just finding a box or something like that. Now, if you get some boxes ahead of time, maybe for certain items, especially if you kind of know, hey, this item's going to require an unusual or a bigger box, you might need to like buy a box and decide whether that's profitable enough for you. One box, a special size could cost you an extra $10 or something for one box, or maybe more in some cases, right? Usually, a lot of times, a cardboard box for a medium, smaller item, it might cost anywhere from $2 to $5 a box, right? But especially if you buy like multiples of boxes, if you're buying boxes ahead of time. Same time, if you have a lot of stuff that you purchase through the mail, like Amazon, eBay, or whatever other stuff you might have shipped, always save basically all your boxes and packing material. Open things carefully, right? So you can save that boxing and packing material. Keep it in a big box in your storage area, your garage, wherever it is. Like I said, keep it someplace where you keep it dry, right? And that way, that packaging is always, you can always have plenty of packages to choose from, boxes to choose from, different kinds of material, padding, packing material that might come with certain things. Yeah, and that way you always have something to pack basically every item in. But before you list it and actually publish it, like you said, do I have access to something I could ship this in if I had to? Someone did buy it as soon as like right away, which is possible. So that's something to take into account when you're publishing. Do I have a way to list this? Like I said, using USPS free pickup, right? Maybe can be helpful, right? You can take a package right over to USPS. Then, like I said, printing the packaging and shipping through eBay probably that way it's already ready to go, and probably going to be cheaper than any other way of getting that shipping, right? Just use the eBay shipping and use according to the size, dimensions, and weight of the item that you're selling actually as it's packaged, right? As a complete package, what is the size, dimensions, and weight, and then shipping that, printing that shipping label, right? The method of shipping that you're choosing or the buyer chose, usually USPS ground will probably be the most appropriate one, right? If they choose a certain shipping method, then they're paying for that shipping method. So that's the method you want to use when shipping it, right? So that's just, a few concepts there behind like listing. I said a bunch of stuff. Like over time, maybe like takes you maybe time. Maybe you have a bunch of items thinking, oh man, I have all these shirts and all these other things. I can have all it's 50 tools I could sell or don't want anymore, whatever it is, and you're putting them in a pile. It's gonna take you some time to list it, right? Just kind of break it down into the doable bits. List the most valuable stuff first, ideally, right? Clean stuff up, get all the components to it, right? And take a good amount of extra pictures, and especially a few extra main pictures, 2 to 3 or 4 extra main pictures of your item, or items that could be used as a main picture in your eBay, because you might be taking measurements of a shirt with a tape measure. Maybe you don't want to necessarily have that as your main picture, but it's in your listing, right? But at least 2 or 4 pictures that could be used as a main picture, because later on you might want to unlist your items that are up there for a while, right? They don't sell and they have no views or little to no views. You might want to unlist them and then relist them again. But between that relisting, or sell similar, I should say, unlist it and then hit sell similar when you want to relist it, if you will. You can do relist. Maybe it's not necessarily any different, but I like to do sell similar. It's going to make it more for sure that it's going to be considered a new listing when you list it again, right? You sell similar to the listing you unlisted, right? You had a listing that was there for a while. It's been there for a while. It hasn't gotten any views in 90 days or more. You decide to unlist it, and then maybe change the main picture to another one of the pictures that you took. You can always take more pictures if you need to, but obviously that's having to break everything out to take pictures of it again. So that's where you want to take a good amount of pictures, the first time, with your smartphone, right? Assuming you're using a smartphone, right? You probably are. But if you're not, whatever camera you're using, bottom line, you want to take a good amount of pictures of the item, and at least maybe, like I said, 2 to 4, potential main pictures that you could change if you have to unlist and then list the item again later. You could use a different picture, a different main picture, a slightly different angle, whatever it is. Might be something simple, but bottom line is, a different main picture. And then also, going into the description and checking the category that it was listed in, double checking that definitely accurate. Make sure it's in the right category. And that's what I find with a lot of times something that hasn't sold for a while. It's been sitting in my eBay listings and hasn't gotten any views for a while. I don't know, it seems like 70% of the time I can actually see some identifiable error in the listing. Like either it just didn't have some descriptive element that would be normally obvious, like this is a men's item or this is a women's item, or there's actually a lot of times just a grammatical error or a spelling or a capitalization error in the title or the description, right? So you want to go in and or maybe in one of the item specifics that you added your own field entry to, and you misspelled it or something like that, or it could have been. So that's another thing. And then adding as many item specifics reasonably that are good descriptive elements of the item, the positive descriptive elements, and at the same time being fully descriptive to a good degree. At the same time, in some cases, it might be beneficial to leave some of those fields blank, right? To maybe you don't necessarily need to put that, does not apply on such and such thing, because then it gets them thinking about, oh wait, it doesn't have that thing. Well, let me look for the one that does, right? So you might not necessarily put anything in some of those fields in some occasions, but for the most part, any descriptive field, where it's made, the fabric type, much as I can, taking pictures of all the tags on a clothing item, or even any item that has any kind of tag on it. Electronics, a lot of times they have labels and stuff like that. Making sure you take pictures of all that stuff, and just to increase the searchability and the definitiveness of the selection for the buyer. They say, oh, okay, this is definitely the item I'm looking. This is definitely the model number I'm looking for. Maybe they look at the item and they're thinking, oh, this looks like the item I'm looking for, but I'm not 100% sure if it's the same model of whatever they're looking to buy, or that could happen, right? So, so if you're listening to the video, encourage maybe you're listening again. Maybe you're the first time a newcomer to selling on eBay, but and I might have another video on some more specifics at the end of this video, to where you can go on and see some other tips that I recommend, but a lot of the same stuff with some new additional stuff. But how to get specifics about your listings, how to make your listings faster and more efficient, maybe having a good clean background for your listings, the factors that can go into those elements, make it sound like a lot of stuff, but once you do a few listings, you start saying, oh, wait a minute, it's just these few basic steps, right? Clean up and compose my item, get all the components to it together, right? And then go ahead and, clean it up a little bit, right? Like, so you clean it up and put it together, refine all the components to your items, right? And then, having a place where you can take the pictures that looks decent background, usually, like I say, maybe an all white background, like a board or something like that. So I have other videos, maybe a couple of other videos that talk about more specifics of that. Like I said, in the meantime, don't discount any item, basically, virtually any item. Don't wrong, you might not necessarily list the super small stuff, or there's a few things that feel like they'd be tedious to list. Leave them towards the end, leave them in your death pile, but mainly just get right to the stuff that looks like it would be the most worthy stuff to list first, or the most valuable stuff, or maybe the biggest stuff you want to get rid of first because it's taking up the most space, or whatever it is that's making you say, oh, well, this is the stuff I want to list first, and focus on those items and do 2 to 5 or 10 of them at a time in a batch. Maybe in the beginning, really just doing 2 items or 5 items to get used to the process of how I'd list an item. You think about you're going to piecemeal it first, right? And 1 step at a time to some degree, but at the same time getting through, a few listings pretty quick. And that way you can get familiar with the process as you're doing. And if you've been doing it for a while, maybe think outside the box, saying, wait a minute, let me just start listing everything that I don't want anymore, instead of just being too selective. Because it's going to overall add visibility to your store. And as long as your listings are honest, right, then people are probably not going to return the item, right? And eBay's going to give you good review and good visibility and more searchability, right? Because they're going to say, hey, your store gets a high feedback rate, ideally 100%, right? If you can keep the any complaints low, and like honestly, I've had 100% for a while, right? I've had like 1 person complain, but then I fixed it, and we fixed that. But maybe 1 or 2 other people like complain, but not like excessively to where it like caused a negative review or anything. But that's out of hundreds of items. So honestly, if you're just making an honest listing, eBay's gonna say, well, bottom line, they're people are buying what they're selling because it's a legitimate sale. They actually understood what they were buying, right? It brought value to them for whatever reasons, right? So like I said, listing a few items basically maybe every day in the beginning is a good idea, because you have a lot of items in your pile, maybe that are building up quickly. You start thinking about this for the first time. Wait a minute, I can sell a lot of old stuff I don't need. I could list this stuff. I can make a listing for some extra things that I think I might want to sell in the near future. I don't necessarily even list them right away. I can make at least the listing. Maybe when you buy stuff, you take some pictures right away. There's different factors that can go into making it more efficient. So you can sell at least a few items every day. Even the first, you're trying to build up your stock of listings on eBay. So don't forget, you'll be doing a bit of listing in the beginning as a beginner with this method to get yourself up to 100 items, 200. You'll be like, oh, 200 items. I don't have 200 items. You'd be surprised if you start thinking outside the box. Wait a minute, I had these old little bottles of whatever. I had this old bottle of makeup that you didn't want anymore or don't use. You have this whatever you might not think much of, but you can still sell for 8 or 10 or 15 or 20 bucks or more, right? Some old hubcaps that you thought I didn't think much of. They're kind of trashy. I was replacing it with another set of hubcaps, and these old ones I didn't think much of, but you still have them in your garage. Wait a minute, if I just kind of cleaned them up a little bit, you sold and you listed them, maybe somebody would give you $50 for them or something like that. Not like a huge deal, but you just throw them in a box and ship them off, right? So don't discount anything. Think outside the box. Anyway, this old stuff that you have, even the smaller items, right? They start selling. You think, wait a minute, that's actually a quick $8 profit or $15 profit. It's not like huge money. I get it. You want to make thousands of dollars a day. Yeah, this ain't the business for doing that, at least right away, unless you have the right inventory. You know what you're doing. But high profit, margins, but also high profitability, where high priced items. Maybe you can sell some musical equipment wholesale. You're able to access it, and you're able to make $50 to $200 an item. Maybe that's legitimate. Maybe you work out some agreement. You get wholesale on certain things. Maybe you're making your own products in some way or something, right? If you get more into higher end, like that's where you're really wanting to make a living with eBay, then yeah. But at the same time, in the beginning, this is going to give you, especially as a newbie, like the grassroots, to get yourself up to, like you said, an extra 100, 200, 300, 500. 700, maybe up to 1,000 listings. At the same time, you're going to probably reach a point you're like, wait a minute, I'm actually selling more than I'm able to list, right? So the idea is your store churns through inventory regularly because you list a lot of items. And like I said, you never know what's going to what's going to sell at any time. You might list 5 items, thinking, oh, this one's going to be a hot seller, and then some item that you've had there for a year or something like that sells. So your mindset is different. You're not thinking, oh, I need to get rid of all this stuff so quickly. You're going to have always a large pile, not, like it shouldn't be like so much of your place that it's like affecting your life in a major way. It's just mainly one area where you might have a dresser, or a hanging area for closet, like clothing items. It's maybe a hanging rack and a couple of boxes or something like that. You might, take up a good corner of a garage, depending on how many things you're listing, right, and how big they are and stuff like that. But like I said, you're focusing on keeping more focus on your smaller, more valuable inventory longer. You're willing to hold down it longer. With the bigger stuff that's less valuable, you want to kind of get rid of it quickly. And maybe in some cases, here and there, cut your losses and just get rid of an item because it's just not worth selling on eBay, right? Or but at the same time, like I said, if you had the space for it and it's not taking up too much space, once it does sell, yeah, that'll open up more space and all that. But you have to kind of make your own discretionary decision on that. But in the meantime, these are just a few tips for you in beginner, maybe mid-range eBay reseller, just trying to resell some old stuff that you had around your place, right? This ain't like some highly advanced approach to eBay, but it is a way to regularly sell a good handful of items every day. Right, basically, it depends. Like you said in the beginning, you're not going to sell that many items because you only have like 100 items listed. You might sell an item, you might not, here and there, right? So you depends on what you're selling. Like you said, you have 100 cell phones listed. Yeah, you're probably going to sell a couple few of them pretty quick. Use 100 pairs of shoes listed. Yeah, you might sell a couple pairs pretty quick, right? Yeah, certainly with 100 pairs of shoes, you're probably going to sell as long as they're decent listings, right? Certain things will sell faster depending the type of item it is. But for the most part, you probably are watching this to get rid of some old stuff. The idea is to get rid of everyday household stuff that you don't necessarily need around your home anymore, right? And that can be involved just a large variety of things, right? So a large variety of things means you're not going to, unless you're getting into super analyzing each category, that's going to be too much with a large variety of things. A large variety of things, you're going to just take some quick pictures, do a Google search or like an image search, right? Whatever it does, circle to search, that kind of thing. Or, you get the Google Lens or whatever you might be using for that to identify the item, find a listing about it and find the basics of it and make a draft listing and just get it published, right? You take your pictures, of course, and measurements and weight, it's a few, like I said, you'll say, wait a minute, these are the 5 to 10 steps I need to do to make generally any listing, right? Generally pictures and weigh and measure, clean up and get all the components of your item. And then, to take the pictures, like you said, and make the listing and make a draft and then sharpen it up between your phone and the mobile app and your web browser, even on your computer, ideally. So you're doing a little bit of both. Maybe you create the initial part of the listing on your cell phone, your mobile, right? Then you save it as draft, you fill in a bit there, and then you go into your computer and finish it up there, right? I find that to be a pretty brisk process myself. So this, like I said, a few nuances about getting started, like reselling a bunch of household items on eBay and understanding that you're not going to sell a bunch of them quickly because they're everyday average items most of the time, right? Most of them. And you're going to have to get a bit of stuff on your store to start seeing regular daily sales. But at a certain point, like I said, it'll get to the point where you make more sales than you can list, right? What is that point? Well, that's going to be probably different for everybody a little bit. I say for me at about 750 items is like if I list 5 items, I might be selling 3 or 5 items the next day probably. You know what I'm saying? It'd be sporadic sometimes. It seems like eBay's a little more consistent when you're more consistent. So that's the main thing I would say. Just be consistent, right? And maybe consistently do a session of listing of 10 to 20 items at least once every week. Then maybe, something like that, right? That's giving you an item or 2 a day that's being listed on average. Maybe you want to do them daily, just 2 or 3 or 5 items. Maybe you're doing more than that. You're trying to do this like a full-time business. You're going to do 10 to 20 or 30 or more items or something like that. You're doing batch listings. maybe you're obtaining a bunch of books or something, like you're finding different ways to source stuff, and that's your thing. You're trying to make it a big business or a medium-sized business, then by all means, that's what I would recommend maybe trying to do. And for me, that's not my mindset with him. Just basically really trying to get rid of old stuff that has reasonable amounts of value in many cases. Don't necessarily want to just throw it away. I could use it as a reasonable extra income in each month to buy some more relevant stuff to my life at that time, right? If that makes sense. And give you some money back, an extra 500 or 1,000 or more a month or whatever. How many items you have listed and you're selling? You have to kind of do some consistency. But if you're looking to make an extra 25 or 50,000 or more, or certainly I'd recommend getting into sourcing, right? Purposely sourcing. I don't purposely source, but I will take anything I come across that I feel in the stuff that I own and probably list it on eBay, right? In many cases. So anyway, this is Mike here with you for a few minutes. If you listen to this far, I appreciate you, and certainly encourage maybe coming back to my channel if you find some other value, and maybe even there's a video coming up right here possibly if you want to take a look and maybe check out some of my other ideas on selling online or offline, to be honest. So appreciate you watching the video. Maybe come back and maybe even like or subscribe. Till next time, maybe see you in the next video. Have a great one.